Hey YouTube, Brandon Ascari coming at you with way too much caffeine this week. I had 1 cup this morning and all of a sudden I have way too much energy. But first, let's go to the intro. And we're back. So what did you just see? Well, that has to do with this week's episode talking about cinematic night footage. So let's talk about ISO, the International Standardization of Organization, or whatever ISO stands for. Most importantly, what it actually does is it is the camera sensor's light sensitivity. Every camera has a different ISO, what we call native ISO. What that means, and we've talked about this in an earlier episode about our camera settings with the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, but the ISO, to quickly recap, but you should go watch that episode. But to quickly recap, the native ISO is the camera manufacturer's set ISO that they recommend that you shoot at that gives you the optimal performance from the sensor. As we've talked about before, if you increase the ISO too high, you start getting a lot of noise in the footage, which we don't want. You start to lose a little bit of the sharpness of the image. And if you go too low with the ISO, not such a bad thing. But keeping that in mind, when you're shooting at night, obviously you don't have as much light available to you, so normally you would have to increase the ISO. That is going to tend to give you pretty bad footage. So the way that we get more cinematic night footage is actually with choosing to shoot at the camera's native ISO, but if you can go even lower than that, then that would be really, really good. So how can we set up our camera in a way where we can keep our ISO as low as possible? Well, tip number 1 is going to be using the fastest lens possible. Now, when we say fastest lens, we mean lenses that have really, really wide open apertures at their most open f-stop. So for instance, I'm shooting this video with a lens that could go to a 1.8 f-stop, which is pretty fast. Some lenses, like the kit lens or a lot of zoom lenses, usually have much slower wide open f-stops, like a 3.5 or a 4.5 or a 5.6. So we want to try and shoot with the fastest lenses possible. Most of the time that's going to be a prime lens, which means it is a fixed focal length, not a zoom lens that can zoom in or out. So I'm shooting with a 1.8 on this camera right now, and that's a pretty fast lens. If I needed to, I have Rokinon Cine DS prime lenses, which go to a 1.5, but for the sake of this example, I'm going to be using my Sony a6400 with my 30mm Sigma f1.8, and I'm going to keep it at f1.8 for all of these shots so I can keep my ISO as low as possible and help me get more cinematic looking clean images at night. Now, are you ready to get technical? I'm ready to get technical. Let's talk about how sensor size plays into this. And this is something that's not as commonly seen in a lot of tutorials where they talk about how the sensor size actually has something to do with the amount of light that can be let into the camera. So when you're talking about sensor sizes, you have, generally speaking, micro four thirds, which is your smallest sensor. Then you have super 35 or similarly APS-C sensors, which is a little bigger. And then you have your biggest sensor, which is full frame, so a bigger sensor. Now, each of these have a different performance in lighting. The smaller the sensor, the worse it is in low light conditions. Think, for example, if you've ever tried to take a picture or a video with your phone at night. Oh my God, they look terrible. The smaller the sensor, they perform better with more light. So if you take a picture with like your iPhone in the middle of the day on a bright sunshiny day, your footage looks amazing. It could rival that of like a professional cinema camera or something, you know, photography camera, whatever it is. But you try to take a picture with the phone at night and all of a sudden there's a night and day, difference between the phone and the professional camera. Reason being really lies in the sensor size. So the iPhone sensors and phone cameras are like, oh, it's so cute. Look at how small it is. And then the sensors grow from there. Traditionally, on film cameras, you would have what we call a Super 35 sensor. Now, since everything's changed and we have digital cameras and DSLRs and photo cameras took over, we now see full frame, which means it's even better in low light conditions because when you had only film as the option instead of digital, there was a huge difference in how it actually played on the film strip. There was a huge difference in how that film strip actually moved through the camera and filled up the space. So the reason why a 35mm film strip was different in a photography camera as opposed to a movie camera, it's actually because in the photography camera, the film strip was stripped across, horizontally. So it filled up the entire frame as the light came through the sensor and gave you the image, whereas a movie camera would spool vertically. So that way when it filled the sensor, you had a little bit of room on the top and bottom, so it was a smaller size because it used less of the sensor. So now when that translates to digital, full frame, because we actually have photo cameras that can shoot video now, actually have the option to utilize a wider frame than traditional Super 35, which are about the same as a crop sensor APS-C camera. So keeping that in mind, what happens is actually in a megapixel to sensor size ratio. Reason being is if you have a 24 megapixel APS-C or Super 35 camera sensor. So if you think about this as the sensor size, you'll have 24 individual, if it's 24 megapixel camera, on that Super 35 sensor. Each one of those, no matter, they'll be equal size, lets light into them. Now, they're a little bigger than, for instance, if you had 24 megapixels on a smaller sensor. Now they're smaller megapixels and they'll let in less light in each one. So that's why the camera performs worse in low light. So for instance, if you have a micro 4/3 sensor compared to a full frame sensor, it is 2 times smaller. So if I had like a 30mm lens on a full frame camera, it's a true 30mm lens. If I have it on a micro 4/3, it's 2 times cropped in because it's a smaller sensor. So that means that 30mm lens is really a 60mm what you see on the frame. So considering that and the megapixels on it, I would have to have half as many megapixels so they could be bigger on the sensor size to let more light in, to be equivalent to like a 24 megapixel full frame camera. Your APS-C would be somewhere in the middle, so it would be like 18 megapixels on that to compete with all the other ones. Not 100% sure if that makes sense, so just know that when you have a smaller sensor, you want for video the least amount of megapixels possible. When you have a full frame sensor, you can have more megapixels and it'll still be equal to or even better quality than a small frame sensor camera. But keep in mind, the less megapixels you have for video, the better that it will perform in low light. Take for instance Sony, their flagship line of the A7S and A7R. Now, these cameras are both incredible quality, but one is like 12 or 24 megapixels in the A7S, and then you have the A7R, which is like 42 megapixels. The reason being is because the A7R is geared towards photographers. More megapixels means you could blow the photo up and put them on bigger billboards. But for video, you would get poorer night performance out of it. The reason why the Sony A7S is touted as the best low-light camera for video is because of their megapixel to sensor size. So, remember, you're usually going to set and forget your shutter speed. You want to set your ISO as low as possible, whether sticking to the native ISO or going even lower. With your aperture, you want to use the fastest glass possible. So that means that you'll look for something that's like an F or a T 2.8, a 2, a 1.8, a 1.5, a 1.4. Anything that's available to you that's fast, you want to use that lens. And then paying attention to which camera you have, if you have the option and flexibility, if you know in advance that you're shooting a film, and that film has a lot of night scenes, you might want to go for a full frame camera with a low megapixel count because you know that that's going to give you the best light sensitivity on your sensor. It will allow the most light in and give you the cleanest image the further up you have to go in your ISO. Sony's a huge champion of low light because they have low megapixel counts in a lot of their cameras to the actual sensor size, so that gives them better low light performance. That's the reason why before that you don't see too often a lot of talk about why they're better, but that's why they're better. So utilizing those techniques will help. Now, last tip that I can give you is really about using what's available to you. There should be a light source somewhere. If you're filming outside, maybe you're choosing a location that has a street light. Maybe you can see the moon. Always playing to those light sources will give you the best possible results you can get. Film at a location where there's a row of street lights on a boardwalk, or somewhere where you could clearly see the moon and it's shining down. You'll get some light to work with. Or if you have battery-powered LED lights that are 5600 Kelvin that'll match the moonlight that's out there, you can bring those lights to help set up a key or a fill or a backlight just to help get you some extra light in the shot. So anything that you could do with available light and with lights that you could provide, assuming you're shooting outside at night and you don't have plugs, then try to use LED battery-powered lights that will be available to you that you can use to help get some type of light in the shot. So if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. Don't forget, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know every time that our episode goes live, Monday and Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Don't forget, give us a big thumbs up if you haven't already, and share this video with everyone around the world, because we are trying to keep this movement going. It's been so strong and I can't wait to see where we go next. But in the meantime, my name is Brandon Ascari of Ascari Digital's Content Creator Academy, and I will see ya!